This is The Secret Library, a podcast about writing and publishing books. I'm Caroline Donahue, a life coach who works with writers, and I'm here to tell you this is your year. It's time to stop waiting and start writing. This is episode 95. I am going to skip the novelist confessions this week because we have a special treat in that we have not one, but two interviews for this week's episode, which I am calling the Swedish Connection, because we are speaking with Swedish to English translator Henning Koch, who translated A Man Called Ove, which many of you will know, as well as numerous other books. And we are also speaking to Lars Kepler, the pseudonym for husband and wife team Alexandra and Alexander Ahndoril. So I want to get right to the interviews because they're so rich and inspiring. And we will get back to the Candid Novelist Confessions in next week's episode. So my first guest for this week's episode is Henning Kosh. Henning Kosh is a translator from Swedish and a fiction writer. His first fiction book was a short story collection, Love Doesn't Work, in 2011, and he followed this up with a novel, The Maggot People, in 2014. Both books were published by Zank Books. Kosh's translation includes work by Hannes Rostrom, Arthur Lundqvist, Fredik Backman, Birgitte Stenberg, Martin Schibbye, Tom Malmquist, and Anders Rydell. One of Kosh's Fredik Backman translations was a 2015 nomination for the Goodreads Choice Awards Best Fiction. It was such a delight to speak with Henning. It was a bit of an adventure. He was in a snowstorm in Sweden and I was in LA, but it was such a delightful conversation talking about the love of language and the importance of translation and how different it is to translate a work versus writing it, but still you need to get inside the voice of the story. And it's a topic I've been fascinated with for ages. So I was so delighted he was willing to come on and so enjoyed our conversation. So I think you will enjoy this first part of our episode, our two-part Swedish Connection episode of the Secret Library podcast. So here we go with Henning Kosh. Hi, Henning. Thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, hi, Caroline. It's a pleasure.
So I've long wanted to talk to someone about the process of translation because I think that language really does inform the book you end up reading, whether or not you're conscious of that as a reader. And let's start at the beginning because I'm really interested in how you came to become a translator, given that you were lucky enough to grow up with many languages, but I'm wondering how you made that bridge into thinking of translation as work you wanted to do.
Yeah, I think like a lot of the best ideas, they suddenly come to you and the process ends up flowing quite well. I mean, the idea of translating was not something I hit upon very early at all because, I was really keen on publishing my own work. So I was writing a lot of my own fiction and in my early 20s and not having that much luck with it. So yeah, one morning I just, my eye fell upon a book in the shelf, and it was a book I'd read as a kid and loved, and it was by a Swedish-Russian writer called Yasha Golowanjuk. And I just picked it out and thought, I'd love to translate that. And I was lucky enough to immediately find a publisher for it. I wrote a really long outline, 30, 40 pages. And they loved it and they commissioned me straight off.
Wow.
That was my first job. So I got lucky, basically.
That's amazing. How did you pick the publisher?
Yeah, you're talking, this is 93. It's quite a way back, but it was a UK publisher called Quartet. And Quartet was fairly well known for having an owner called Naima Talla, sort of quite eccentric, very rich Middle Eastern man. Actually, he's Lebanese, and sort of a benefactor of the arts. He also had a magazine called The Literary Review, and he absorbed a lot of losses, and he was all for culture and the arts, So I kind of knew about him, and I think they were my first port of call because they struck me as the sort of people who might take a risk on a new name and just an idea out of the blue. And they did.
That's fantastic. So how was it? You had this idea. I'd love to translate this book because, what a shame that people outside of Sweden haven't read it. And then how was it to actually sit down and do it? Was it really daunting once you said, okay, I'm going to do this? How was the process of actually translating the whole book?
It was daunting. And now when I look back on it, I realized, I fell into all the traps, all the most obvious traps. And this is where you discover so much about your own character and how it operates, So the trap I fell into was this tendency to get a bit, how can I describe it? Highfalutin, sort of mock serious, his tone wasn't that easy. It was quite a difficult first book to take on, And I think one reviewer picked it out, I think it was in The Spectator, picked it out as a book that was enjoyable, but with a rather leaden tone.
Oh, dear.
And I think that kind of is a fair critique, It was a bit leaden, but I learned a lot from it, and I don't, regret it. But I probably would have done it very differently today.
I think whenever we look back on writing that happened a long time ago, there's always changes, probably. How long did it take you to get through that first book?
I think it took me about 4 months, 5 months, something like that. I mean, I probably worked very slowly.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I can remember having an old typewriter I did it on. I didn't even have a computer, I also remember the house was being redecorated. I was renting a flat in London, so I had a guy on a ladder outside the window a lot of the time.
Oh, wow.
Talking to me through the window, which, didn't exactly help my speed of working. But it was a very interesting time, and that's when I really started getting into translation, I think, as an activity. And I also came into contact with a wonderful sort of network in London called CELTA, which is short for the Swedish English Literary Translators Association. And, CELTA was a great, and I do think anyone who wants to get into translation, maybe, someone who's not tried it, that is a good start. And it really worked for me because I met much older people who were really experienced and who were really helpful. And also we published a magazine, so I got the opportunity there to publish excerpts from books I liked. I tried a few poets, So I could then have a crack at, classic authors like Arthur Lundqvist, who is a Nobel Prize winner. But then also more, contemporary people I liked. And it was fine. You could do, 3, 4, 5,000 words and get them into the magazine. So, that's how I kind of built my skills, I guess, as a translator.
So then you translated that first book, and then how did you, obviously you enjoyed it because you went on to do more. How did you then pick a project? Like at this stage, or as you evolved through your career, how did you find the works that you wanted to translate? Did they come to you, or did you continue looking for authors that you were interested in at first?
I've always looked for authors I like. And, and I can say with complete honesty that in all the years I've been a translator, have I only once influenced a publisher to publish a book. Because almost always, and all translators will back me up on this, you get approached and you get asked. Publishers are very, very sniffy about going along with a translator's suggestion because there's a whole quite rigid system there. They're listening to their scouts, they're listening to their agents. And if you come in as a translator to say, hey, you should think about this book, you're kind of hijacking a process there, and it makes them very insecure.
So you had no idea how much you were subverting the system with that first book?
Well, I did actually, and that was actually 2 years ago.
Oh, and not even that first book, but the first book they weren't planning to publish.
Oh, that's true. Yeah.
So we've got bookends.
That's
the most
true.
recent and the one.
That's true, yeah.
Yeah, so tell me about the one 2 years ago. What happened?
Well, that was Tom Malmquist, In Every Moment We Are Still Alive, which has just now been published by Melville House.
Yes.
And that's a wonderful book. I got sent that by a publisher in the UK who wanted a reader's report. I loved the book. I gave a glowing report on that book, and they passed. So then I immediately went to Scepter, who'd published Backman's books. I had done three of Backman's books with them, and they picked it up pretty well straight away. They were taken aback. It wasn't their usual way of working, but they took it on, and I think they're quite glad they did, because it's a really good book.
Yeah, and it's gotten a lot of glowing. You're not the only one to write glowing things about it.
Yeah, but it's powerful. Well, that was a real. I think that for me, it's been the translation I've really enjoyed the most. It was also a real challenge, getting that very intense opening and really getting into Malmquist's pace and that feeling he has of being, that feeling of dislocation in the hospital.
Absolutely. Well, can you say a little bit about that story for people listening who may not know about the book?
Sure. It's an unbelievable story. It's, in a sense, everyone's nightmare. It's a man and a woman. She's heavily pregnant, and she's, very close to the period when she will go into the hospital and go into labor. And suddenly she's diagnosed with leukemia, and she goes into crisis, and she's basically fighting for her life with a healthy baby in her womb. And that's where the story begins. It's all true as well, although it's fictionalized. I think Malmquist would feel quite strongly about that. I mean, he is drawing on his experience, but I think I wouldn't like to say too much about his reasons for writing it or the degree to which he considers it fiction or not.
Right. But it's a powerful sort of, I don't want to say conceit, because it's not, it's what happened in his life, but it's a powerful beginning for a story. And then how did it, I mean, you read the book to do the reader's report, but how does it impact you when you're translating something like that? Do you feel like you're living inside the story? And obviously it has to get inside your head, and you have to find a way to bridge one language to another. How does that impact you as the translator when you're working on it?
It impacts you. It's difficult to describe, but I think what happens to me anyway when I'm translating anything is I suddenly kind of get into gear with a tone, register, language, and the voice, of the writer, and you get the sort of fusion of who you are or what you're trying to do, and the writer, and you kind of click into a process there. It takes you a while. I actually know a translator who's quite highly regarded in the UK, and she told me once she likes to start translating a book halfway through.
Interesting.
Yeah, because she says when you start reading a book, you need to feel, drawn in straight away. And she says for her, it's more effective. Start in the middle. The middle section, you can always clean it up a bit later, whatever. But if you start there and then go to the beginning, you're in the flow, and then you can start off on a really good note. That gives you a good idea of that process, I think.
That's a great idea. Do you work primarily between Swedish and English, or do you do other languages as well?
At the moment, I only work from Swedish into English, but I have tried other Scandinavian languages, and that's okay, but I prefer not to do it. And actually, I don't think I'm going to do it anymore. I've had a few bad experiences with it. And I speak pretty good Spanish, also read in Spanish. So that would be a kind of ambition of mine, I think, to start working from Spanish. But then we would probably have to go and live there for a while.
Right.
I think especially at the moment, there's so much fantastic fiction coming out of Spain and also South America, of course.
Well, it's projects to have. I'm wondering how, when you sort of go from Swedish to English, do you find that the words that you have access to in English change the tone? This is always the thing that, I mean, this is my fantasy of, if I spoke the languages I spoke well enough to translate, that the personality of a language, I feel, is they can be different from each other. And how do you work with the fact that the book was originally written in Swedish and then you're trying to carry the personality of Swedish into English, but using English words, if that makes sense?
Well, it can be quite tough, especially with humor. Like, for instance, you mentioned earlier, A Man Called Ove. That was difficult because, for a start, Ove doesn't exist in England. He can't exist in England. You don't, and yet he's enough of a sort of stock character, you could say, for anyone in the world to recognize the grumpy old man, But somehow the things he is grumpy about place him in such a Swedish context. So I think the answer is you have to recognize the cultural distinctness of the work you're translating. Its setting in a culture, in a language, and make it clear that you are actually translating something set in that culture. You're not trying to make it sound, American or English. It's a real tightrope, but you have to just show people and keep showing them all the time, hey, this is happening in another language. It's another culture. People are like this here. And yet you have to give them enough familiarity with the language for them to feel, I'm reading a book. I can tap into this. I can be a part of this. I'll give you an example. I got a job translating a play once, which ended up going to Edinburgh Fringe. And the play was called Stars on the Ceiling. It was sort of a hit play in Sweden, and it became a film and everything. And there was a company called Fredik Backman, and they took it to Edinburgh. We sort of tried to culturally adapt that play to make it feel to a Scottish or British audience, you could say, that it could be happening in England. And that didn't work. And some people who went to see it said, there's something strange about this. And thinking back, you can't do that. That was a big error. You have to respect the distinctness of the work. And actually, people don't mind. I mean, when you read Dostoevsky, you want it to feel Russian. You want it to feel very Russian. You don't mind, references to Russian words or whatever. You like that.
Yes.
Reading a novel from Russia. So you would hate it if you start, if you saw references that weren't Russian, or if the characters started using inappropriate words or do you see what I'm driving at?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think part of it is almost that people want to feel like they're reading it in Swedish or in the original language, even though they can't.
Exactly, yeah. But the jokes, I mean, that's terrible. You can't translate it. Many of the jokes, they can't be translated. That's why with Ove, we had to really edit that. We had to really rework that, a lot. I don't think I've ever reworked anything that much. We had regular contact with the author and with the agent, and because we knew we were pushing pretty hard, but there was no other way of doing it. I mean, by definition, a joke has to be funny to, and not puzzling. So, we had to do that.
Right. That I didn't even think of that as a challenge, but of course it makes sense. And the cultural references, I think, are fascinating. I mean, I particularly am fascinated by this sort of obsession that we see internationally with Swedish culture that's happening, particularly in literature. I mean, I think, prior to the girl with the dragon tattoo, there was still there. But since then, there's been this kind of Swedish noir, Nordic noir. Like everybody wants to watch, crime shows from Sweden. And as a big fan of Bron, I have to say, as an aside, I am so jealous that you all get to watch it and they haven't translated it into English yet, the latest season. But there is this kind of love from the English-speaking world for the Swedish world. And how is that perceived sort of on the Swedish side? Is everyone mystified by this sort of desire to consume as much Swedish literature as possible, or are they thrilled, or how does that come across?
Well, the Swedish publishers, of course, love it.
Oh, I'm sure.
They've been riding that wave for a while now, but I think more and more, and also film industry is really sort of monetized itself here now, and a lot of the bigger film companies are being bought up by international companies, and making. So it's an industry. It's a mixed bag. There are some really good, interesting writers coming out of that, but there are also some literary writers who maybe are not having great sales, and they just end up tapping into it for some easy earnings. It's a big subject, that. Some people are critical. Some book people, literary people are critical, of course. They're saying, hey, we have a broader literary culture than this. But on the other hand, if it helps publishers, then I guess it's good for all writers.
I think that's a perpetual struggle, though, is that things get reduced to types, or that, people want to read a particular kind. I mean, people like crime fiction, no matter what culture it comes from. But that what are we missing? What voices are we missing that maybe aren't as easy to sell or aren't as easy to place? I think that is an important question.
And it's very puzzling that it should have, that crime writing should have come from here. I mean, a place where, I go out and I don't really lock the door, there are no crimes here as far as I can see. Literally. Where I live, for example, typical Swedish small place, I don't have to lock my door. I don't even lock my car. It's parked outside. Sometimes I leave a key in there all day. I don't even think about it. No one will come and steal my car. And yet, when I go down to a bookshop, it's just full of these crime stories. Maybe Swedes, they enjoy it. It's a bit of excitement. But it doesn't really reflect the society very much. Of course, we have a few crime hotspots, Malmö and Stockholm, Gothenburg, but really it's pretty light.
Yeah, that's true. It's almost like there's this, it feels almost sort of like a Carl Jung phenomenon of you've exercised all of your urges towards crime into literature, so it doesn't need to play out in society.
It is like that.
So you started in your 20s working on all of your own literature, and you have since published your own work. So how is all of the translation work playing out as you're working on your own books and your own writing?
Yeah, basically, I have to keep them completely separate. If I'm translating, I don't do any writing whatsoever. If I'm doing writing, I don't do any translating whatsoever. So, for example, this year we were down. I often go down to Sardinia in the Mediterranean to write because I used to live there, and now I have a young family. We go out there, and this year I decided I'm going to finish my novel this year. So I didn't take any translation work for 7-8 months, and I just did I worked on that, and I finished a new novel. And I couldn't really have combined that with translation because it's all writing, and I do think translators are writers, but the discipline is so different.
Yes.
It does feel quite distinct to me anyway. The process can't really be compared.
No, I think I can see where, you're working with language just as intensely, but you're just not coming up with the plot and the story and the characters, but you still have to sort of take it in and then put it back out, which is a whole different process rather than generating the story from the beginning. Is that accurate or is that completely off?
No, I think that's pretty accurate. It's a bit like, I think being a translator is a bit like being a studio musician and being called in, and then the band says, we need a kind of a couple of licks here, sort of like that. Can you play it like that? Yeah, okay. So, and then you just play those licks and that's it. You've done your job. It takes the skill to do it,
Right.
I think a lot of translators are really skilled writers, but they're sort of playing to a script, let's say.
Oh, that's fascinating. Yeah, there's that movie, 20 Feet from Stardom. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's all about exactly that, like background singers and how their process is just as disciplined as anyone else's, but people don't necessarily see them because they're working in the background. I love that comparison. So, no, go ahead.
No, go on.
I was going to ask more about your novel.
Yeah.
So did you finish it? And you've been working in Sardinia. How wonderful.
I finished it. Yeah, it's finished. And, I was publishing with Zank before, Zank Books, based in Ann Arbor. And so I published my short stories, Love Doesn't Work. Those are called, very uplifting. And then I published a novel which was a bit experimental called The Maggot People, also with Zank. But now Zank have got all new editors now, and I feel they're a good publisher, and so I'm sort of going out talking to some agents now. I've written this novel about I don't know if you want me to go into the.
I'd love to if you're willing to.
Well. I've never been a great pitcher. I don't want to feel I'm trying to pitch here on your podcast.
No, we want to hear about it. I would love to hear about it.
Yeah, it's basically about a sort of late middle-aged guy, maybe a bit like me, who has a son who has quite a serious or very serious climbing accident and sort of ends up in a coma. And it's the story of this man and also the mother of the young guy, and how. See, I'm making it sound so depressing. He finds this stone in the forest, and he sort of has a small clot in his brain, and he ends up going into a care home, and then all he wants to talk about after that is the world he sees inside this stone. And so the wife, Rebecca, she starts to visit her husband in the place, and she starts keeping a blog based on all these stories. They're pretty fantastical stories. And the novel is basically a story of the blog she writes and the sort of adventures she has. The blog published, and finding a young local entrepreneur who is into blogging and into the whole business of blogging. So it's a sort of meta. It's got a bit of meta, talking about the arts and talking about culture and so on.
It sounds wonderful.
Yeah, it was great to write, and I've been planning it for a long time. But I like I say, it takes me much longer than it should to write novels now, because I have a young family and I'm quite busy. So I have to try and find these little windows, and I have to create them. I already have my next book sort of more or less plotted. And I guess I'll just do another mad rush at some point. I mean, I think for me to write a novel takes maybe a year and a half altogether, 2 maybe.
I think it takes, everyone always says, I mean, and speaking to people who've written novels, there's always this sense of, I wish it didn't take me so long. Yeah. But it seems that that's sort of the minimum to get it down, if you really want to get it done the way that you want. And I wonder if having this pressure of finding these pockets, does that help? Because then you get to plan the thing in advance a bit. And then you're waiting and kind of building up all of this steam. And then you have this window where you can finally let it out and write. Does that help your process?
Yeah, that's very true, actually. I mean, I had so many notes by the time I sat down, and I sort of structured things pretty carefully. And, I had a lot of dialogue written down. And so I really just felt, like a berserker, going in there, my battle axe is held up, and, I wasn't going to stop until it was done.
That's so great.
Yeah, and you do have to think about things, it's not just writing, it's, maybe you're thinking about something for a year or two, maybe, and then suddenly you think, hey, I could write that. And then you start thinking about that. So maybe, the whole process is like that. So
I think so. I think there has to be this point when it shifts from something you're sort of pondering and wondering about to something that's actually going to go down. Like, oh, yes, because there's all these ideas that float through and it's like, maybe, and then they go away. But the ones that don't leave and just keep on insisting,
exactly.
I think are the ones that end up getting written down. And so you finished this one and you already have another one plotted out, you said?
Well, I wouldn't say plotted out, but yeah, I've got...
But it's
present. I've always wanted to write a travel book. I mean, a travel novel, if you like. And so I figured now's the time I should do it, because I traveled quite a bit when I was, a bit younger. And, I traveled, I did one particular trip to Venezuela and the Dutch Antilles and up towards Colombia. And so much happened on that trip, so I would love to write about it.
That sounds fantastic.
Yeah.
Also, I think the beauty of writing books that are set in other places is the excuse to travel more.
Well, I'd love to. I mean, like I say, I've got 2 kids now. One is only 2, and so...
so that's a bit tricky.
You can do little trips, but it's difficult to stay away for a longer period unless you base yourself somewhere and everyone comes over, and that can also work fine. I've had a lot of opportunities to travel, so I'm not so worried about it. But yeah, sure, it would be great to, and also branch into nonfiction. Would also be really interesting.
So I'm curious about, do you ever think of translating your own work, or is that something that people just don't do?
I think you can, but I don't actually feel that comfortable writing directly in Swedish. I'm working on it. It sounds odd, I am bilingual and from a totally Swedish family, but I do think most translators prefer to work one way, and because I grew up in England and because I always wrote in English, it's kind of more my native language than Swedish. And the other thing is that speaking skills, reading skills, and writing skills are all, distinct in the brain. So, while I can sit down with a Swedish book written in very intricate language and read it and understand absolutely everything and get a real feeling for the beauty of the language, I couldn't sit down and write that language in Swedish because it's a different part of my brain. So, to produce language is different from absorbing it. Most people don't translate their own work. The ones that do tend to need to hire an editor later because it's so hard to very few people have that totally interchangeable skill with language.
Yeah, I would think you'd be so close to it. And it would be, in some ways you would think, if I wanted to have written it in Swedish, I would have written it in Swedish in the first place.
Yeah. But sometimes it is quite annoying to look at the book market here and think how you'd love to, submit something you've written in English. But, like I say, very few people have done it. I mean, you're talking some real, Nabokov did it.
Right.
But, that's Nabokov.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think also if you've sort of had this pent up need to write one novel and you've already got one kind of building, then and you really have to set aside translation in order to write, I can see why you wouldn't want to spend more time on a book that you've already finished and said, I've finished it. Now I want to move on to this next thing that's building, rather than, revisiting the whole thing to do it as a translation project. Because with translation, you get to visit other books.
That's really true. I hadn't thought about that, but that's probably in practice. That's probably very much how it works. Yeah. I wouldn't want to sit down and translate my own book because it's not a useful sort of way to spend time.
But would you think about submitting it to be translated and for other people to send into Sweden? Or do you feel like it's okay that it lives in English and it's okay that it stays where it is?
It's okay, but it's a pity that the longer I work, in translation and writing, the more I feel that publishing is quite rigid. The whole system, it's a really elaborate, rigid system. And Swedish publishers, although there are lots of grants available and they could, in theory, take on, for example, a new book, an unpublished book in English, if they like it, and get a grant to have it translated and put it out there, they somehow don't want to go there. Just as, Swedish agents, I know all the agents here because, I work for them, but
right.
They just don't want to take anything in English. So there's a rigidity in the system.
Yeah. I wonder, I can sort of, if I was to put myself in that mindset and as an outsider, but English is so pervasive. I could see a sense of, well, we want to do things that are from, the inside of the country. But it is also nice to be able to read things in translation. I also think that, everyone in Sweden seems to speak better English than I do. So the sense is, well, people probably don't. Do they need it in Swedish? Maybe.
Yeah, that's also an issue. You're almost getting to a point now with nonfiction, especially. The people who are reading nonfiction could just as well read in English. But then, then you get into the whole argument of what is a language then? A small language, a fairly minor language like Swedish. If we're not careful, we'll just end up cancelling out our own literary culture, because it's important. It's important to keep publishing books in Swedish.
Absolutely. I think this is one thing that I have felt deeply ambivalent about someone who is English as a native language, is that it, for whatever reason, has ended up being the one that people talk even as intermediary languages between other places where the language is so difficult, like business people in Asia, learning English to talk to each other. And I worry about the loss of other language and what does it mean? What does it mean when it becomes easier to speak in one language versus another, and what happens to the culture that's left behind if you ignore those other languages?
Yeah, definitely. I think, in Europe, I don't know how it works in the States. Here in Europe, we've got the EU, they've got like quite a big cultural program, and, there are lots of grants available for translation, especially, the minor sort of languages of the EU, like the Baltic states and Scandinavian countries by population, so we can maintain it all here.
That's great. Yeah. We are sad. We are sadly lacking, I think, in our just because the country is so large, and the only border we have with another language is with Mexico. We're not really dealing with a language barrier, obviously, with Canada. So I think people get very set in their ways, and they're not as interested in learning other languages. I learned languages in school, and I loved them, and it was a great passion of mine. And whenever I speak French or German in Europe, they ask like 9 countries as to where I'm from before they and I identify myself as American, and they freak out. They're like, "What? That's impossible." Because we're not great about it. And it's a great, I think, it's a disappointment to me that we don't have more investment in that here.
But it does seem, as a European who's doing more and more in the States, it does seem like there's this wave of interest in translation. And, I don't know if that's It does seem that
That's
way
great.
to me anyway. A lot of, you've got so many great magazines, online magazines that are dedicated to translation. Malmquist, for example, there's an interest in the whole translation process there, which, and this podcast you're doing about translation.
I'm glad. That makes me feel optimistic, because I think it is important. It's important both to respect the language, but also that people read stories that are more different than their own. I think when you live in a country like the US, where, the same language pervades the whole country, in many ways, there are so many other languages spoken here, but we don't necessarily read in them. And I think that it's wonderful when you do read things in translation and you read stories from other countries and other cultures, because it opens up your awareness of what people are like and how they live all over the world that's different. I think that's something important to remember. Well, I'm so grateful that we got to speak today and overcome international lines and technology and all kinds of adventures to record this conversation. And thank you so much for coming on and talking about this topic. It's really been a joy speaking with you.
Caroline, it's a pleasure.
My second guest for this episode is Lars Kepler. And there was a period when no one knew who was behind the pseudonym Lars Kepler. They only knew that it was a pseudonym. But now we know that it is the husband and wife team Alexandra Coehlo Ahndoril and Alexander Ahndoril. They are the authors of the Juna Linna series, and they have written 6 installments to date together, and the series has sold 12 million copies in 40 different languages. They were both established writers before they adopted the pen name Lars Kepler, and have each published several acclaimed novels on their own. Alexander grew up 20 kilometers north of Stockholm, and he's always been an avid reader, but wanted to be a painter in his youth. For many years, he produced big oil paintings inspired by Caravaggio. He practiced Muay Thai and was accepted into a ranger unit, moved to central Stockholm, and studied philosophy, religion, and film at university. His first novel was picked up when he was only 19, and before he began writing as Lars Kepler, he had already penned 9 novels, 20 theater plays, and 1 opera libretto. Alexandra grew up in southern Sweden, and she discovered early on that she wanted to become an actress and attended the National Academy of Mime and Acting in Stockholm. She thereafter got a master's degree in literary science, was hired as a PhD student at university, and began writing a dissertation on the Portuguese poet Fernando Pessoa. She produced 3 historical novels before she began writing together with Alexander under Lars Kepler. I adored this conversation with Alexandra and Alexander, because it was so amazing to me to think of how they were able to create this independent identity of Lars Kepler, who became such a success before anyone knew who it was. And actually, at one point, people thought it was Henning Mankell, and both the publisher and Henning Mankell himself categorically denied that this was the fact. So I really loved talking to them about the process of creating together versus writing alone, which is what so much of writing often is for everyone. And this provided a really sweet story about how they work together and how much they love writing together, which is infectious and very obvious, as you'll see from the conversation. I really loved the book as well, and it is called The Sandman. And hopefully, if we're lucky, it looks like their entire series will be coming to us in English. So I know you're going to love this conversation as much as I did. So here we go with Lars Kepler, Alexandra, and Alexander. Okay, I'm very excited to have Team Lars Kepler with us on the show today. Thank you both so much for being here.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Yeah. Thank you.
So you were both successful novelists independently before you decided to collaborate. So I am so interested. I want to dive into the book specifically, but I'm really interested to hear about how you decided to work together and write together under Lars Kepler, and how that process has been. Because obviously this isn't the only book you've written together. There have been a number of them, so it appears to be going well. So I'd love to hear about how you decided to do that and what your process is like working together.
Well, fundamentally, it's very lonely to be a writer because you don't know. You know that you can't let anyone else what you're doing until it's finished. Because if you do, you might lose this, spark you need for this specific story. I don't know why, but you can ask almost any writer. So because of that, we had this dream of collaboration to find a way, to sidestep the solitude aspects of writing.
Yeah, but it wasn't as easy as we thought to bring together two writers. We love each other and we have been married for many years. We have 3 daughters. We thought it would be a piece of cake, but actually, we can laugh at it now. But we had a lot of failed attempts before we found the key to collaboration.
We actually started.
What was the key? I must know the key.
Well, the key was the third author, Lars Kepler. We tried to write a children's book, but we just started to argue, and Alexandra became so grouchy. And then we tried to write a play because that would be easy, we thought. I had been an actress for many years. Alexandra had written many plays for the theater. But it wasn't until we invented Lars Kepler that we could bring our styles together into a totally new author.
And it sounds maybe silly, but we managed to trick ourselves in some way when we created this third author. So since then,
we don't argue. We are just so happy, and we have this.
It's like a creative flow. We call it a jazz session, like we're jamming.
That's amazing. Do you have a sense of who Lars Kepler is as a person? Like, do you picture him or like what he wears and what he does with his time? Like, does he have a whole identity?
He has a whole identity.
And habits and all things.
Yeah, he used to be a teacher. And then a personal tragedy made him a very lonely and shy person. And all these stories came to him. So nowadays he works nights at hostel for homeless, and then he writes all day long. That's his biography in a way.
I love it. I love it. That's so wonderful. I think it's almost like you're novelists writing the novel of Lars Kepler, who's then writing the books.
Yeah,
exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
I think
actually,
that's why it works for us.
That's amazing. Because the voice is so seamless. It's always fascinating to me to think about collaborating. So if you don't mind, everyone listening writes. So they're very curious, I would assume. I will speak for them. That's my job. In how you actually do each of you say, oh, I'd like to write that chapter, and then the other one goes in and reads it? Or how do you make it? Because it does not appear, it feels like Lars Kepler has been to his job in the evening and then he writes, and it feels like just one person writing the whole story.
That makes us very happy to hear, because we want to have one tone, a specific Kepler tone.
But it's a pretty long process. It starts with the idea, of course. The idea is important. We always find our ideas through conversations. We talk about what we fear and moral dilemmas and so forth. And suddenly we have heart of the story. And then we start with a plot. And we write hundreds of notes with all the different scenes. And then we put these notes on a wall so we can overview the plot, and we start to, what we say, dream up the story. So not until we have the plot completed, we sit down in front of our computers and start to write. And
then we write the scenes we want to write from the plot, and after a while we email them to each other.
So we sit side by side and emailing our texts to each other, and we're filling gaps and
changing things, and the email forward and backward to each other. And then after a while, when a book is finished, we don't know who wrote what, because there's not a single sentence in it that only one of us has written alone. And that's when we say that it's the work of Lars Kepler.
That's amazing. I love that.
I think this thing with the notes on the wall, and having the plot clear in every detail, it's so crucial for us, because when we start to write, the story comes alive in a certain way. And that's a magical moment. Yeah. And then you have to follow the characters. Yeah.
So it's both disciplined with a detailed plot, but then you have to follow, and there comes the jazz in.
Yeah, the jazz session.
Yeah, we
I don't know if this is understandable.
It absolutely is. It's great. It sounds wonderful, because it's true. You do, when you sit down to write, you fundamentally sit down to write alone. And I think that's what becomes very discouraging for lots of people, is you spend so much time, as you say, working on a project, and people may ask about it and say, oh, how's it going in there? And you say, oh, I'll get back to you in 6 months or something.
Exactly. I'm sorry, I can't tell you anything about what I'm writing, because then my story will disappear. So no, haven't taken down this wall of loneliness. It's actually the most enjoyable thing we've ever done. It's fantastic for us, this collaboration.
I love it. So let's talk a little bit about the Sandman, which I started reading late at night, which was probably a terrible idea. And my husband was already asleep, and I was there reading the book, and I was like, oh, this is really scary. And, which I'm sure was the intention. And the other thing you did that I thought was very smart was the chapters are very short. So you keep saying, oh, I'll just read a little bit more. Oh, maybe just a little bit more. And then I woke up in the morning and I was like, I could read just a little bit more. And it's very difficult to put down, not only because the story is so good, but because you're like, well, it's just another page or two. I could read a little bit more. Was that on purpose?
Oh, well, yeah, we want to write as exciting as possible. And I think there is a certain rhythm in the book that needs these chapters. It's also
we enjoy page turners ourselves, to read page turners, and short chapters works for us. So
yeah,
I thought it worked really well.
Every book has its certain
rhythm and tone, and for us, crime fiction looks like this.
Yeah, at least.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think also there's so many threads going on that the nice thing is you kind of keep visiting different aspects of the story and what's happening here and what's happening over here. And because, you have different people in very different locations, but all working on the same kind of case.
Yeah, we want to, that's also why we work with these notes on the wall and everything, because we want to have as many turning points as possible. We want to create a roller coaster for the readers, because I think reading and writing is very similar to us. When we write our books, we sit there, our hearts pounding, we cry, we have to get away from the computer a while and breathe, and so it's a very physical experience as well. That's why I think we love these stories. They are filled with our own personal fear, but we also have this guarantee that we will take you out of there. We will solve the crime.
I wondered, how was it to come up with someone like, I'm probably going to pronounce his name wrong, Ulrich Walter? So terrifying.
Yeah, I know. We did a lot of research about serial killers, and we focused on...
We talked to, psychiatrists and...
Oh, I thought you were going to say you talked to serial killers. I was like, wow, that is dedication.
No, we talked to psychiatrists, criminologists, police officers, and then we focused on those who seemed to be intelligent and who communicated and had strategies. Right. And then we used this research. We used it towards our own fear, our deepest fear. We let it interlace somehow with the fear and reality. And then Ulrich Walter was born. And actually, he's so terrifying that I had nightmares almost every night during writing process. I dreamt that he was after us. So
I'm not surprised. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if he would leap out of the book and come after you. I mean, he's pretty intense and pretty clever and pretty unable to be contained.
Yes, he is pretty intense.
I think empathy is the most important thing for us when we write, and that comes. You have to understand each character in a book, and that even the worst ones, yes, because he has his own logic, and you have to feel for him, even though you don't agree with his methods, of course, but you, as a writer and even as a reader, you have to understand him.
Yeah, because describing a person just like a monster, that was never really interesting for us. We wanted to know why and how he became this serial killer, what has happened to Ulrich Walter. And that's more terrifying for us. We always want the reader and ourselves to be able to understand the motives, because in real life, you never get the answers. But I think that's important for crime fiction to that you have the answers.
Because
definitely,
it always starts with chaos. It's a journey from chaos to order, I think, for us crime fiction. So it starts with this horrifying villain, but it must end with answers. The mystery must get solved, and so forth. So it's always a journey from chaos to order, and that's the entertaining part, because it's a scary story, but it's entertaining because it ends in order. That's where we believe anything, in a way.
Well, I want to thank you both so much for taking the time to come on the show and talk about the book, and to talk about Norwegian crime, or Swedish crime, and Scandinavian crime, and the Sandman, and the amazing process that you have writing together. Thank you for listening to the Secret Library podcast. The show is produced by me, Caroline Donahue, and Frederick Barry McWilliams Jr., my tireless audio engineer. To get show notes for this episode and all other episodes, please visit secretlibrarypodcast.com. To get updates, literary love, and notification when new episodes are posted, sign up there for Footnotes, my newsletter. And to learn about life coaching with me to work on building your writing life, visit carolinedonahue.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. Gold stars to everybody who leaves a rating and review on iTunes. We're so grateful. Until next time, happy reading.